Good evening, everybody. How you guys doing? You guys weren't falling asleep on me right now, are you? At 7 o'clock? Okay, good. Just checking. So glad you guys are here. You guys are in for a treat. I'm gonna pray and then reintroduce our leader tonight. So if you don't mind, let's bow in reverence and let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the opportunity to continue to grow and to learn so much. There's the man who's speaking tonight is just a wealth of information. He's put in so much time taking in the history of not just leaders like King, but just of our country. So he's just pouring on us great stuff, great material. Let our ears be open. Please, Lord, take the lead tonight. Speak through him and speak through all of us as well. We say this and pray this not by might or by strength, but through your spirit. In Jesus' name, all of God's people said, amen, amen. Reintroducing our leader tonight, Daniel Hahn, grew up in Sacramento, went to Sacramento High School. We got a McClatchyite over there, my cousin hollering. Chief Hahn became a police officer for Sac PD, ultimately rose the ranks, became chief of police in Roseville, and then he took the job of chief of police of the city of Sacramento, first ever African-American police chief in the history of Sacramento. And he did it at a time we desperately needed. We're all calling for Chief Hahn to be the chief of police because of all the things that were going on. Sacramento needed him. He filled that role spectacularly, and he did it so well as he took heat from both sides of the political aisle. He took heat literally from everybody, and he stood tall and did the right things, and still was just a God-honoring person in that position. So, would you guys mind giving up for our leader tonight, Chief Daniel Hahn?
Thank you, Pastor Bob. I'd be remiss if I didn't say this. Pastor Bob and many other people in this community helped a lot in some of the most challenging times. I would say there's probably a lot of times where these folks, including Pastor Bob, didn't necessarily agree with what the police department had done or something like that, but they still came together to support our community and support our city. And it's something I think Martin Luther King would have for sure done. So with that, just a couple housekeeping things. I think the table right in the back to the left, if you got the munchies, there's some cookies back there. Thank you to Greg Elmation, who brings cookies every week. So if you're hungry, go grab some cookies. You don't need to wait till the end. So thank you for that. And then before we jump in, I wanted to, before we even do that, I want to read a poem, a short poem that kind of relates to what we talked about last week and some of what we're going to talk about today. So this is from Langston Hughes. Does everybody know who Langston Hughes is? If you don't, you can follow me on social media. I've been posting all this month on key figures and events in Black history. So Langston Hughes in 1951 wrote this poem called Harlem. And it goes like this. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? So in chapter 1, we're going to watch a quick video to tie in last week to this week. I know some of us weren't here last week, so last week we talked, the first chapter in the book, Martin Luther King talks about, like, where are we in that time he wrote the book, 1967? Where are we as a country? Where are we as a country as a whole? Where are we as a Black community? And he talked about all these laws and things that were written and passed in our country, yet issues still persisted. Specifically, he talked about the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and then he writes about how the president at the time, Lyndon Johnson, said that this was the last major shackle to be removed. to make us a whole country, to make us one country, to eliminate all these things, discrimination, segregation, all these things. Then Martin Luther King goes on to talk, not too long after he signs that bill, there were still riots in cities around our country. So, in other words, clearly that wasn't the last shackle. And later on in the book, he talks about unenforceable laws, unenforceable rules, laws, things like that. What he means by that is enforceable laws are like speeding. If you're speeding, a police officer can pull you over and write you a ticket. He can enforce that. And there's a penalty for that. Laws on the books, there's penalties for that. You can go to prison, you can pay a fine, you can get fired, all these different things that are enforceable. For example, if you're a family, you can enforce the fact that you take care of your children. You got to provide food, you got to provide shelter, and if you don't, that can be enforced. You can be charged with that. But an unenforceable law, if you will, is that you love your children, that you care for your children. Those things, there's no law. That's an unenforceable law. But still, without that, we are not really a community. And so he talks about these things that happened even after the last major shackle was removed. And one of those was so August 6th, he signs the Voting Rights Act, the president. August 11th, the Watts riots break out. So if it was the last major shackle, why did the Watts riots break out? The Watts riots broke out over a lot of reasons. Discrimination, lack of opportunities. One of those things, does anybody remember I wasn't alive in case any of you smart Alecs are out there, but in 1964, we had on the November ballot, the statewide ballot, something called Prop 14. Does anybody remember what Prop 14 was? One, maybe? Yeah, there's been a lot of Prop 14s, but the 1964 Prop 14. Prop 14 was on the ballot in November of 1964. Now remember, housing discrimination was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in the late 40s. I think 1948, Yet, in 1963, William Rumford, who was a state legislator from Berkeley, put forward a bill that said it would be illegal in the state of California to discriminate when it comes to housing, selling or renting a house, solely on the basis of race, religion, and a few other things. And it passes. So in 1963, even though the Supreme Court already said you can't do that, in California had a law that said you couldn't do that. So the California Real Estate Association, who, by the way, the realtors were really the driving force behind redlining and things like that. They didn't like that because they couldn't do redlining, blockbusting, things like that. So they funded and put forward something called Prop 14 that said you could discriminate solely on the basis of race and religion. And it passed by 65.7% in the state of California in 1964. So I always try to put it into context for me. My brother was alive in 1964. My sister was alive in 1964. Obviously, my parents were alive in 1964. None of them lived in California. But this passed in our state in 1964 to be able to discriminate solely on the basis of race. And so one of the driving forces to the Watts riots, which you'll see a video of in a second, was Prop 14. So in this book, Martin Luther King talks a lot about the enforceable laws, that we write all these laws, but the frustration that's boiling over in our country, not solely by the black community, by the way, results in riots and things like the Watts riots. And a couple years later, in 1967, we had what was called the Long Hot Summer, which was over 150 riots where cities were burning across our country. Very similar to Ferguson, Baltimore, things that we've seen in the more recent past. And so without further ado, I guess I have the clicker. So just wanted to watch a couple of minutes to bring last week's into this week.
The Detroit riots. In 1967, a riot broke out during a long, hot summer night in the Virginia Park neighborhood of Detroit, Michigan. Lasting more than 2 days, it was one of the most destructive riots in American history. We're going to take a look at what set the riots off, the riots themselves, and the consequences. In the late 1960s, the civil rights movement in the United States was growing stronger, but racial inequality was still a big problem. Deindustrialization of the cities and the desegregation of schools was causing a reshuffling of neighborhoods. As part of integration efforts, people of color moved into urban areas that were once predominantly white. But in response, many white people fled to the suburbs, some scared of integration, and some having lost their factory jobs. This phenomenon is called white flight and contributed to segregation. With many whites having fled urban centers, business owners and politicians neglected these new, mostly black neighborhoods, leading to overcrowding and deterioration. While Detroit spent money on developing and racially integrating the inner city, black residents of neighborhoods like Virginia Park were still dealing with housing and employment discrimination, poor access to medical services, an underfunded public education system, and racism from law enforcement. On July 23, 1967, at 3:15 a.m., the Vice Squad of the Detroit Police Department conducted a raid on an unlicensed bar on 12th Street in Virginia Park. Although it was late, the street was full of people trying to keep cool because of a heat wave. While the police were making arrests, a brick flew through a police car window, prompting the riots, looting, and fires that would rage for days. On July 25th, Governor George Romney called in the Michigan National Guard, and the riots finally ended on July 27th. But the damage and human loss was unprecedented. 43 people died. Over 1,000 were injured. Over 7,200 were arrested. More than 2,000 buildings and structures were damaged, and hundreds of families were left homeless. The riots accelerated the exodus of white people from the city, making segregation even worse. But it also drew attention to the problem. President Lyndon B. Johnson appointed a commission to figure out why the riots happened. The report found that white racism, discrimination, and poverty were to blame for the riots. It warned, quote, "Our nation is moving toward two societies, one black and one white, separate and unequal." 2 years later, the Stonewall riots would occur at the Stonewall Inn in New York City, which was targeted in a raid very similar to the bar on 12th Street. Like in Detroit, the spontaneous violence at the Stonewall Inn also resulted from discrimination, but this time against the LGBT community. The Stonewall was a popular safe haven for New York's gay community. Detroit and Stonewall would be the most destructive riots in U.S. history until the 1992 Los Angeles riots, which reflected similar issues of inner-city racial segregation and discrimination. The Detroit riots remind us that even a century after the Civil War ended, the violent legacy of racism and discrimination was still present in American culture, a legacy that echoes through modern society, where protesters and activists still fight for racial equality across the country.
All right, so one of the things I think, and I'd love for all of us to think about this as we go over the last couple of weeks of Martin Luther King's book, is how committed are you? How committed am I? How much are we willing to sacrifice? What are we willing to do for the things that we believe in the most, whether it's here in church, our faith, at work, at home? If you think of how committed was Martin Luther King to this belief that we should all be equal, and the way to get there is through nonviolence. Well, he's been stabbed, many assassination attempts. Ultimately, he did give his life for that belief. He had to fight elected officials. He had to fight the police. He had to fight leaders, police chiefs, sheriffs, and he had to fight within his own groups, specifically with the black community that wanted the same end goal but had different beliefs about how to get there. And that's one of the things that we're going to talk about today. So before we get to the next slide, I'm just going to go over real quick some of the things that were in this chapter. So first, he starts out with talking about James Meredith. Does everybody know who James Meredith is? If not, I really highly recommend you Google him. He's a very important figure and did a lot of things in for our country. But what Martin Luther King talks about is in 1966, unlike a lot of the marches at the time, James Meredith wanted to do a march all by himself. And he was going to march the 220 some odd miles between Memphis and Jackson, Mississippi, that he called the March Against Fear, to encourage people to register and vote because the Voting Rights Act had just been signed. But shortly after he started marching, he got shot in the back and he was hospitalized. So Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders go visit him in the hospital, and they tried to convince him that they will continue the march as a group. And for a while, he's like, nope, not having it. But eventually, they convince him that the march is important, and so they will finish it in his honor. And eventually, he actually joins them near the end. But it's in that march that the division within the civil rights organizations and people fighting for civil rights becomes widely known and public. And so it's a fight between nonviolence, like Martin Luther King's side, and Black Power. So Black Power had been around for a little bit, but this is the first time it becomes really in the public sphere. So as they're doing this march, the people start chanting Black Power. And believe it or not, Martin Luther King is very much against that. He doesn't like the saying. He doesn't like the motive behind it. He goes on to say that anybody with ultimate power is going to treat other people bad. He wanted to work together with people. And so he has this conversation with these other leaders. Stokely Carmichael, who at the time was the chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, is the one that really publicly introduced the issue of Black Power. And they finally come to an agreement that during this march, they won't say either saying. They'll finish this march, and then the Black Power advocates can do their thing. So in the book, he talks about some of the things he heard as arguments that this nonviolence movement is not working. And just think about it. We've done this nonviolence for years. I'm still getting beat by the police. I still can't buy a house certain places. My kids still can't go to school in certain places, et cetera, et cetera. Matter of fact, I don't remember what chapter it is, but Martin Luther King says when he's writing this book in 67, that the schools are more segregated now in 1967 than they were in 1954 when Brown versus the Board of Education was passed. And you could actually see, if you study our schools now, they're pretty segregated to this day. They're not segregated because the school law says they're segregated. They're more segregated now because of the remnants of redlining and housing discrimination that puts certain groups in certain neighborhoods. So some of the sayings he heard during this march were, I'm not for that nonviolent stuff anymore. Things like, this should be an all-black march. And if you notice any pictures of Martin Luther King in marches, there's all different races in those marches. It's not all black. They said, you know, the song, We Shall Over. So people said, that song is dead. We shouldn't sing that song anymore. They specifically said, quote, this is a new day. We don't sing those words anymore. In fact, the whole song should be discarded. It shouldn't be, we shall overcome. It should be, we shall overrun. And here's Martin Luther King. No, nonviolence. In light of false promises, Martin Luther King goes on to say, in light of false promises, right? We signed a voting rights bill. We had an amendment already. In the 1800s, we had a voting amendment, yet we still can't vote. He said, in light of false promises, nonviolence would eventually be questioned. I can only take getting beat over the head so long before I start wanting to bring the fight to them. The answer, he says, to this dilemma between nonviolence and Black Power can only be found in persistent trying, perpetual experimentation, and persevering togetherness. On page 32 of your book, he says the debate might well have been little more than a healthy internal debate. And he's talking about the media. And if the antagonist is not there, the press will find and build one. Does anybody notice that about the media today? I saw a news clip today where they were talking about ICE doing these raids. And I don't remember what city it was, but they were going to do a raid in some city in the last couple of days. And they said there's some internal somebody in the FBI that snitched off that the raid was coming to the community. And when they arrived, everybody was gone. And the reporter goes, "They scattered like cockroaches." And I thought, wow, is that the news? Or like cockroaches? That automatically gives me this negative connotation, as opposed to they weren't there when the FBI got there, right? They got tipped off and they left. They scattered like cockroaches. So those are the kind of things that Martin Luther King's coming up. If there is not some evil thing there, then he's saying the media will create one. It says the gap between promise and fulfillment is distressingly wide. When he's referring to the federal government not enforcing these new laws or old laws that they have on the books. He said racial segregation is buttressed by such irrational fears as loss of preferred economic privilege, altered social status, intermarriage, and the adjustment of new situations, meaning people are reluctant to give up power, to give up money so other people can have equal rights. And that's what we're fighting for. That's what the nonviolence movement was, to get these people together to say tomorrow will be better for all of us. And people that are frustrated with being discriminated against and having all these things happen to them are going, no, forget that. We're going to take the fight to them. And so I just wanted to go over some examples of that. So as you just heard, in 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education resulted in a 9-0 vote, unanimous vote of the U.S. Supreme Court that basically said separate but equal is dead. Like it's unconstitutional. Plessy versus Ferguson was the law of the land at the time, that as long as you had separate schools for black students, then you're okay. The U.S. Supreme Court said no, because that's not equal. You must desegregate our schools. And they literally wrote in their decision that the end of segregation must, quote, happen with all deliberate speed, unquote. But that's all they wrote. They didn't say how it should be done, what should be done. And so the result is schools remain segregated, even though the law of the land says you must desegregate schools. And just in case you didn't know, the Brown versus the Board of Education was a case out of Topeka, Kansas in 1951, where the daughter of Oliver Brown was made to ride a bus to a segregated black school further away from her home. So they took it to the court, they lost, eventually they appealed it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that these segregated schools are unconstitutional. So, but 3 years later, 1957, the Little Rock Nine attempted to enter Little Rock Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. And the governor of the state, even though the U.S. Supreme Court, the law of the land, said you must desegregate schools, this is the picture to the right and the bottom left. The governor decided he wasn't going to let that happen. Now, he had ran on a platform of segregation then, segregation now, segregation forever. So he decided he was going to disobey the U.S. Supreme Court, along with about 1,000 members of the community lined up at the school and blocked the 9 African-American students from getting into school. It took them a couple weeks for them to actually get in, and kind of the last straw was a white pastor walked his 5-year-old daughter into the school. 9 students eventually got in with the help of the 101st Airborne Division. This is what happened to them while they were at school. So first of all, they had to take spare clothes to school. Why do you think they had to take spare clothes to school? So the clothes they had on their back, and they took some more clothes that they kept in their locker or somewhere in the school. Why do you think they had to do that? Spitting, food thrown on them, those sort of things. Just think if your kids had to go to school because of that and had to keep clothes because of that. They would be spit on, cafeteria food thrown on them. The students' families face consequences too. Their parents' work dried up. Meaning, oh, your kid's the one that's trying to integrate our school, you're fired. 3 of the 9 students graduated. The rest of them left or got expelled. Only 3 graduated. 6 years after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that schools should be desegregated, schools still weren't segregated. Little Ruby Bridges. Everybody's probably heard of Ruby Bridges, right? Anybody remember how old Ruby Bridges was when she integrated the elementary school in New Orleans? 6 years old. And this is what happened to her. She was actually born 3 months and 22 days after the Brown versus Board of Education decision was decided. And when she was 6 years old, they still didn't want her to go to school. Parents removed their kids from the school. This is actually the one where the white pastor walked his 5-year-old into the school and said, I just want my daughter to get an education. I don't really care who goes here. Teacher, imagine this. Every single teacher in the school said they will not teach Ruby Bridges. My wife is a 5th grade teacher. I should, when I get home, I'm going to tell her, hey, tomorrow go to school and tell your principal you're not going to teach that kid. You see what happens. But nothing happened to them. Barbara Henry, who Ruby Bridges talks about all the time. I had the privilege of hearing Ruby Bridges speak here in Sacramento. She was from Boston. She decided she'll teach Ruby Bridges. She was the only kid in Barbara's class that whole year. She spent lunch with her. She spent the recesses with her because none of the other teachers would teach her and none of the other kids would be in class with her. Her dad lost his job at the gas station. The store stopped letting them shop there. Her grandparents were sharecroppers in Mississippi and they were turned off their land, all because a 6-year-old wanted to get an equal education with everybody else. But Ruby Bridges will tell you every single time she speaks that many people, white and black, still helped her. Her neighbors who were white babysat her and her siblings. Her neighbor gave her dad a job. So Ruby constantly talks, anytime I've ever heard her speak, about this isn't, this was some people that decided they wanted to be racist or whatever. Not all people were like that. We talked about James Meredith earlier on that march that Martin Luther King joined, that the Black Power movement really became public. Well, before that, James Meredith, by the way, was an Air Force veteran. He attempted to integrate the University of Mississippi in 1961, which is 7 years after Brown versus the Board of Education. They told that they wouldn't enroll him, so he fought it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled that he must be admitted to the school. The governor, Ross Barnett, appointed himself as the registrar for the University of Mississippi and denied Meredith entry. So Attorney General Bobby Kennedy decided that he needed to reach an agreement. The governor actually tells Bobby Kennedy that if he has the federal officials, federal officers come and point guns at him, then he'll enroll James Meredith because then he can say, hey, they were going to shoot me. And of course, the Attorney General said, we're not going to do that, but you're going to enroll. So eventually the court threatened to arrest the governor and fine him $10,000 a day or a week or something like that. And so he eventually gets entry. The U.S. Marshals arrived to help escort him just like they did Ruby Bridges. And angry mob formed. They threw bricks and shot guns at the federal officials. 2 bystanders died. 206 marshals were injured. 28 of them were shot. Soldiers were wounded. 200 people were arrested. And eventually, several weeks later, James Meredith gets in. This is all while the Supreme Court says that you must allow James Meredith into this school. And yet, the people in Mississippi around the school and the governor said, no, we're not going to do that. So it's what Martin Luther King is talking about is when you write a law, there has to be follow-up. You have to enforce that law. You have to ensure we have to work on people's hearts and what they've been trained over the years and all those sort of things. And the last, I think that might be the last example. So, no, the last example is the one you see, where is it? Top left. So that's the University of Alabama. Where, again, the governor decided he was going to block the entrance of 2 African-American students, the first 2 to ever enroll at the University of Alabama, the same Alabama we see on TV every day. This is in 1963, 9 years after the Board of Education versus Brown. George Wallace, the governor, He blocked the door to the university. That's a picture of him actually doing that. That's the guy talking to him is from the Department of Justice, telling him, yo, bro, you need to get out the way. These folks need to come in. Vivian Malone and James Hood attempted to enroll. It's called what they call this whole event is stand in the schoolhouse door. James Hood only lasted 2 months. He started he lived in a dorm, and on his floor of the dorm, he was the only student in there other than the U.S. Marshals that were guarding him. And eventually, he just couldn't take it anymore, so he leaves. Vivian Malone spent the next 2 years there. Her safety was not like the Little Rock Nine kind of safety issues, but there was bombs exploded on campus, and she eventually graduated. 2 years later, in 1965, she received a Bachelor of Arts in Business Management and became the first black student to graduate from the University of Alabama. But it had to be fought for, even though the U.S. Supreme Court had already ruled. So Martin Luther King has this power struggle between people that want the same things, right? They want equality, they want to end segregation, they want to be able to get jobs, they want to be able to live the American dream, live out the Constitution, but they have two different ways of getting there. And so we get to the Black Power movement. So the Black Power movement publicly started in the 60s and 70s. You can watch many movies on it. I just watched one on the Black Panthers on the plane on the way home from Phoenix last weekend. Black Power movement wanted to create economic, social, and political power of their own rather than seek integration into the white-dominated society. So right there, that's against what Martin Luther King believes. He believes we all have to rely on each other. He says we can't create our own stores and our own whatever. There's not enough of us. We have to integrate into this country. We can't leave to Africa. He goes, I ain't leaving to Africa. We need to work together. It was based on false promises. You know, we sign these bills, and yet I still get the same discrimination. I still can't go to this school. Deferred dreams and unpunished violence. And you'll hear in the last couple of weeks when we have things like the Freedom Riders and other things, people like the President of the United States calls out the Freedom Riders, like they need to chill because it's causing violence, but doesn't call out the people that are perpetuating the violence, the sheriffs, the militias kind of things, the Klan. As I said earlier, Martin Luther King says, disappointment produces despair, and despair produces bitterness. And he goes on to say that when you're bitter, you can't differentiate between that one person that's doing something to you and the whole group, right? You blame the whole group, even though it's just one person, through bitterness. And the gulf between laws and their enforcement is huge. And he says that eventually will create things like Black Power, where people are going, we're going to take the fight to you. We're going to shoot you. We're going to do these things. And so one of the most visible, one of the most public and visible manifestations, I guess you could say, of Black Power is the Black Panthers. Did anybody know, raise your hand if you knew that we had a Black Panthers chapter here in Sacramento? Okay, what neighborhood was it in? Does anybody know? Oak Park, yeah. So we're going to see a little bit of that. So the Black Panthers, they're founded in 1966 by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. They were students together at Merritt College in Oakland, and they decided to start the Black Panther Party for self-defense in October of 1966. It lasted till about 1982, although there's still a Black Panther, like a renewed one, going on right now. They instituted a number of social programs. I just found out, which again is why we need to teach history. It probably would have made me more interested in history if I had knew things like this, but I just found out maybe about 2 years ago that the church I grew up in, the Oak Park United Church of Christ, that my mom was the choir director in, I guarantee you my mom didn't know. I don't think the pastor knew, but our church was used as the feeding program for the Black Panthers. I spent my whole life in that church and never knew. So the Black Panthers were started in 1966 in Oakland, and early activities were involved in monitoring the police cop watch, what they would do is they would take shifts and they would drive around Oakland and the Bay Area. And when they'd see a police activity, like a police officer pulling somebody over, they would stop, they would get out, and they would monitor it because they were tired of being brutalized by the police and all these other things, right? Except they would monitor it fully armed, right? They'd have rifles and shotguns and all these things, which was 100% legal at the time. In California, you could carry a loaded firearm in public back then, right? So they would exercise their lawful authority and they would get out and do this. So obviously, if you're a police officer at the time, you're probably like, this is not sitting very well. I know these people hate me and now they're standing behind me with these guns, right? So we'll get a little bit more into that, but I wanted to just go over a couple of just so you get an idea if you weren't familiar with their motives and what they stood for. I'll just read, they had a 10-point program that they called the 10-point program. Number one, we want freedom. We want the power to determine the destiny of our black community. 2, we want full employment of our people. 3, we want an end to the robbery by the capitalists of our black community. 4, we want decent housing fit for shelter of human beings. 5, we want education of our people that exposes the true nature of the decadent American society. We want education that teaches us our true history and our role in present-day society. 6, we want all black men to be exempt from military service. Because the Vietnam War and all that, they're like, we're going over there killing people and we don't even have rights here at home. 7, we want an immediate end to police brutality and the murder of black people. 8, we want freedom of all black men held in federal, state, county, and city prisons and jails. 9, we want all black people, when brought to trial, to be tried by a court, by a jury of their peer group or people from the black communities. 10, we want land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace. That was their 10-point program. Now, they had internal fighting too. They were involved in violence. So eventually they kind of fell apart. But it's what Martin Luther King was talking about. If you fight violence with violence, eventually it can't sustain itself. And so the Black Panthers are really, if you read this chapter and what Martin Luther King says, why he was against the Black Power movement, the Black Panthers are probably a perfect example of what he's talking about. I'm assuming all the people that raise their hand know that the Black Panthers, a few months after they formed in Oakland, primarily the Oakland Black Panthers came to Sacramento and went to the Capitol with guns, right? Walked into the Capitol. It's hard to imagine today because you won't get through the front door with a gun today. But back then, again, it was legal. So the reason they went is because there was a state legislator, Don Mulford, from Alameda, that proposed the Mulford Act, which was going to ban guns. And the reason they wanted to do it was because of the cop watch, right? The Black Panthers are showing up on traffic stops and other activities of the police armed. So he's proposing a bill to say you can't be armed in public. Basically the law we have today. That's what he was proposing. So the Black Panthers were against that because they're saying, well, you guys are beating us up and shooting at us. We need to arm ourselves to protect ourselves. And so they go to the Capitol fully armed. I don't know if it was the greatest decision. Fully armed to fight against that bill. It actually did the opposite, got them to pass it like the next day. So they show up and they get stopped. They make it all the way to the assembly floor, basically. A few of them make it onto the assembly floor. They get stopped by the police, the state capitol police. They get detained. All their guns are taken. But eventually their guns are given back like a few hours later because it wasn't illegal. So they kind of escort them out of the Capitol. They give them their guns back. They make some statements. I'll read you their statements here in a second. And then they leave and they drive in car loads, a bunch of cars full of Black Panthers, drive down to 15th and L, which was a service station. And the Sacramento Police Department shows up there and arrests several of them. And they arrest them under a little-used code of disturbing the state legislature, which probably had never been used before, right? But initially, they let them go with their guns because it was legal. So these are some of the things that Bobby Seale said in front of the Capitol after they had been escorted out of the Capitol. He said, quote, he called upon the American people in general and the black people in particular to take careful note of the racist California legislature, which is now considering legislation aimed at keeping black people disarmed and powerless at the very same time that the racist police agencies throughout the country are intensifying the terror, brutality, murder, and repression of black people. They referred to the racist war in Vietnam and reactivating concentration camps. This is what they said. Reactivating concentration camps that were used in World War II to house black people who were trying to gain their freedom. They also talked about lynchings, the atomic bomb, genocide, and genocide practiced on Native Americans and slavery. The Mulford bill passed very quickly after this incident, and it was signed into law by Ronald Reagan, who was the governor. Want to play a quick video of that incident. And we're looking at this through our lens of today, right? This was back when all of what they're doing is legal. Oh, real quick. This is the headline of the Bee. And just as a quick note for anybody that's into history that wants, a lot of times if you read history today, if you read 5 different accounts of history, they might all be a little different, like people are telling it through their lens. So I try to get as close to the actual incident and read what was written then, and even then, who knows. But this was the Bee article the day after they went to the Capitol, the headline, Capitol is invaded. You can, for free, you don't have to pay a dime, you can sign up for a library card at the Sacramento Library. You can do it all online. That's how I did it. And then you can go to magazines and newspapers, and you can search the archives all the way back to I think the Bee started in 1857. And that's where this came from. I printed this out from their archives, and I took a picture of it and added it to the slide. And so you can read what the actual media said at that time, not 100 years later. So here's the video.
The Black Panthers entering the Capitol building armed with guns in protest 57 years ago. Thanks for being with us here at 6. As you can tell, lots going on. Yeah. I'm Tony Lopez.
A lot to get to, and of course, we're keeping you up to date. I'm Hunter Sowards, in tonight's Politics at Large. Steve there at the Capitol with Steve, the lasting legacy of that protest. As Tony said, 57 years to the day.
Of course, it captivated the country then. It's hard to even imagine now, but on this day in 1967, entering the California Capitol building with an open carry gun was not against the law.
Yeah. All right, hey, Charlie.
Black Panthers in their trademark berets and leather jackets carrying handguns and shotguns through the halls of the California State Capitol. State police only stopping the men after 10 had reached the assembly chambers. The shocking 1967 protest was aimed at stopping state gun control legislation seeking to prevent the Black Panthers' police patrols, their practice of following officers in black neighborhoods. Black Panther Bobby Seale spoke about the Black Panther mission then.
We don't hate nobody because of their color. We hate oppression.
People come from all over the country to sit here.
Bill X. Jennings took me into his Sacramento Black Panther archive room to show me the history of the movement, including this photo of Jennings walking into a courtroom with Black Panther founder Huey Newton. Jennings said it was the Capitol protest that put the Black Panther movement on the map.
That particular incident went worldwide because this is an image of a black man, standing up for themselves. Like, hey, we're not going to take this anymore.
It caused us to really think about what folks were willing to do in desperate circumstances, for sure.
Sacramento State Professor Dale Allender says this 1967 social justice protest opposing gun control laws then stands in stark contrast to most social justice movements now.
And they see guns as part of the problem, our over militarization in schools schools, in communities.
It's my intention to make it a felony to bring a loaded weapon into the state capitol.
Following the Black Panther protest, Republican Assemblymember Don Mulford added an urgency clause to his gun control legislation, passed it, and then Governor Ronald Reagan signed it into law, making it a felony to publicly carry a loaded firearm without a permit.
That video is still so shocking to see half a century later. Not surprising, people are still talking about that protest at the Capitol today, and the Mulford Act is still state law.
So you think about what Martin Luther King is going through, right? He's trying to convince our leaders that if you aren't receptive to the nonviolence movement, eventually frustration and all these things lead to the Black Power movement and movements like that where more violence is going to happen. He's trying to convince leaders of that, and then in his own community, he's trying to convince them that this is not going to work. Like you can't use what you don't like. You can't utilize those same tactics against the people you don't like. And so, again, I go back to what I mentioned when we first started tonight. How convicted are we? How committed are we to our beliefs? Martin Luther King was committed. Like he said it over and over, no matter what the pressure is, I'm going to stay the same. And I'll repeat again what I said the first week, that Martin Luther King is much more revered and liked now than he ever was in life. When he was alive, he took a lot of heat. So that brings us to Sacramento. Does anybody, I didn't put it up there, did I? Does anybody know where in Oak Park the Black Panthers office was? Yep. So if you go down 35th Street, down the street from Fixin's, where you see the post office and then the housing development right there, that's where the Black Panthers, and you'll see it in a video in a second. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of history of what happened with the Black Panthers here in Sacramento. They were, let me find my notes. So I'm going to read you some of the information that the chief said at the time. It was in the B. I wasn't, again, I didn't live in Oak Park in 1967. I wasn't born in 1967. So in 1967, there was a lot of challenges in Oak Park. Oak Park had been a neighborhood that was not integrated, and then it became integrated. All the economic vitality left the neighborhood. The freeway was built, all sorts of different causation for that to happen. And now there's some challenges in Oak Park. And so the racial tensions were rising in Oak Park between the community and the police. The police chief at the time was a man named Joseph Rooney, which is the South substation on Franklin Boulevard is named after Chief Joseph Rooney. He put extra officers in Oak Park on this night on June 15th because he said there was an increased number of complaints from black and white residents of Oak Park regarding the conditions that were occurring on Sundays. He said there was this is his quote, "A bunch of hoodlums have been taking over, blocking traffic, double parking, leaving their cars in the street, spinning wheels in the grass at McClatchy Park. And there has been an increased number of assaults, windows of stores broken, threats on lives of persons working there." And so he put extra officers in Oak Park on that Sunday. And there was some rocks and bottles thrown at cars. And officers called on the radio that they were under gunfire. So they said snipers from the rooftops were shooting at them. Over 100 gunshots were fired from shotguns, rifles, handguns. 15 to 20 people were hit with gunfire, including police officers and several community members. Nobody was killed. The Sacramento Union newspaper reporter was beaten, kicked, and stabbed by a group of people. 38 people were arrested on charges ranging from curfew, assault, unlawful assembly, displaying a firearm in a threatening manner, and disturbing police. The police department later that night, as a result of all this, raided the Black Panther office on 35th Street. They seized 3 rifles, a shotgun, and over 1,000 rounds of ammunition. So the video you're going to see right now is the following day. The Black Panthers invited some of the council members and the mayor. The mayor was Richard Marriott at the time, to take a tour of the Black Panther office. And basically what you'll hear them saying is, there's no way we shot at the police officers, because if we did, there'd be bullet holes all over the place and there would be dead police officers, and there's no dead police officers, and they're showing them there's no bullets in the wall. So this is actual video of the mayor taking a tour of the Black Panther office. This is the only video I've seen of the actual office in Oak Park.
Well, you know what you're saying. Yeah, but what you're saying, though, you see, is
that's the mayor right there.
Before you go over, you want to and I want you to see that there ain't no bullet holes at all. Now, if rifle fire had came out of that building there, that door, there should be holes somewhere over here.
But they're using blanks.
If a bullet had came through that door, one of the policemen would have been dead, because Panther too bad in that. And at that close range, they were standing right there on the sidewalk. If we had been shooting at those cats, one of them would have been dead. With a rifle?
Somebody told a lie.
That's right. I stood to the door and I asked the cop to let me take the sister to the hospital. And the dog said he didn't want nobody to come out the building. And when I turned around to walk back in, to tell everybody to throw up the refrigerator and all the food, we just had to throw out because they threw it on the ground. And most of it was eggs and things like that we had to clean up.
I want you to see this.
Mr. Mayor, can you give me some reaction to what you've seen here right now?
well, I can only tell you, I think I'm a little shocked and horrified.
At what, sir?
At the condition of these quarters.
And what are your plans right now?
Well, I don't have any specific plans. We've just completed a meeting. We are now examining what has happened and seeing with our own eyes the shambles that was created here. And I am certain that the council, in its next regularly scheduled meeting, or perhaps even a special meeting, will get further into these matters, and in this sense, hopefully come up with some what are called in today's world meaningful solutions. We can't continue this. It must not happen. It just must not happen.
It's going to show the people that they're doing something that they have never done before, rather than sit around and listen to other rhetoric, other people saying that what has happened, and they take a stand on what has happened from.
Are you satisfied that this is what you say concern?
No, I'm not satisfied. Just because they see it don't mean they're going to work.
So let me ask you this. This was 1967. The mayor said, we're going to come up with some solutions so this doesn't happen again. And we're going to solve all this. 1967, do you think he did? Think those conditions went away like in the next couple of years after 1967? I moved there in the mid-1970s. Those conditions still existed when I lived there. I think some things are probably starting to change now. But so last thing on Oak Park. So a couple years later, 1970, issues are still going on. So I guess I just answered my own question. Officers attempted to arrest a subject in McClatchy Park. Two officers went into McClatchy Park after a guy they thought had a gun, or they actually saw him with a gun. A crowd, as they're chasing after this guy into the park, a crowd of about 30 people basically surrounded the officers and blocked them from chasing after the guy, and the guy keeps running and gets away. One of the radios was knocked out of the hands of the officer, and the lieutenant that was on scene was punched in the face. Officers pulled their revolvers to get the crowd back, and it finally eventually de-escalates, kind of calms down. A bunch of other officers get there, and then as one officer is leaving the scene, later on in the afternoon, he's driving down 35th Street about 10:30 at night in his squad car, and there's snipers on the top of Joe's Style Shop on 35th Street, and a bullet comes through the roof of the squad car and hits Officer Bernard Bennett, 24 years old, in the head and kills him. Two members of the Black Panther Party, Jack Strivers and Mark Teamer, were arrested, and two non-members of the Black Panther Party, Booker Cook and Sirocco Cabrales, were arrested. They were referred to after that as the Oak Park Four. They were arrested for killing the officer, and they were ultimately acquitted due to a lack of evidence. And to this day, the case remains unsolved. So you have a community, a country that is frustrated and looks at the nonviolent movement. There are successes in the nonviolence movement, but yet many conditions still persist. So frustration builds and builds to the point where this Black Power movement starts and things like this start happening. And Martin Luther King said, if you start shooting people and things like that, the resistance to that, they're going to blame the violence on what they're getting ready to do to all of us. And that's another reason why it won't work. And so, do we have disagreement on how, is everybody in here think our country is as great as it possibly can be right now, or we can get better? Right? That doesn't mean you're not patriotic. That doesn't mean you don't love this country. It can be better, right? I think of my daughters all the time. First of all, you can't tell me nothing about my daughters, but they ain't perfect. And there's a lot of times where I get on them or want them to be better. I still love them more than anything in this world, but I know they can be better. That's the way I look at our country. I love this country. I wouldn't want to live anywhere else. Martin Luther King felt the same way, but he knew it could be better. So what's the best way? So today, is there disagreement on how to get there? I see it every day in the streets. Not everybody agreed with the protests that happened in Sacramento. They all probably wanted to get to the same place, but they disagree on how to do it. So how do we move forward to where we're successful in getting to a better tomorrow? The tomorrow that Martin Luther King saw when he looked over, the mountaintop and saw what he saw, right? How do we get there? So, the tabletop exercise, we'll give about 10, 15 minutes. And then if anybody's willing to share, we'd love to hear it. And then, of course, I told you, music always tells the story of the time. We'll have a song. I'll read you some lyrics and see if you can tell me what song it is before I play it. But I wanted to read, if you turn to page 64, the bottom of page 64, I'm going to read you two paragraphs that pertain to the tabletop exercise. So the bottom of page 64, MOK writes, the ultimate weakness of violence, he's talking about like the Black Power movement and advocacy of violence. The ultimate weakness of violence is that it is descending spiral, begetting the very thing it seeks to destroy. Instead of diminishing evil, it multiplies it. Through violence, you may murder the liar, but you cannot murder the lie, nor establish the truth. Through violence, you may murder the hater, but you do not murder hate. In fact, violence merely increases hate. So it goes. Returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. And this is a famous quote that you've probably seen around for Martin Luther King. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. And then at the bottom of page 65, he writes, talking about leadership, ultimately, a genuine leader is not a searcher for consensus, but a molder of consensus. I said on one occasion, if every Negro in the United States turns to violence, I will choose to be the one lone voice preaching that this is the wrong way. Maybe this sounded like arrogance, but it was not intended that way. It was simply my way of saying I would rather be a man of conviction than a man of conformity. Occasionally in life, one develops a conviction so precious and meaningful that he will stand on it till the end. This is what I have found in nonviolence. So for the tabletop exercise, I'd love for you to do two things. So like I said, in Martin Luther King's time, at the time of his death, he was nowhere near as supported then as he is today. So how do we individually and collectively, say as a church or this group, support and motivate such leaders? Leaders like Martin Luther King. Secondly, be specific. How would we support? If we had a leader that really could bring people together and really could, through different means, get people to the table and start figuring out how do we make tomorrow better for all of us, how do we support that person when there's, all sorts of haters and other folks around? Secondly, how do we individually and collectively support the talk about darkness doesn't drive out darkness? How do we individually and collectively support making our nation a better place by supporting light and love? How do we individually and collectively support making our nation a better place by supporting light and love? So go ahead, and that quote is from the page I just read. Go ahead and discuss that at your tables, and then we'll do a quick report out. And then we'll listen to a video that represents the time period we're talking about. Go ahead. Okay, let's try to wrap it up. We got any volunteers that want to share a little bit of your discussion? Any tables? I can pick some tables. Anybody want to share? Yeah. We got some brave souls over here. Oh, right there. It's coming.
So the question was, how do we individually and collectively support and motivate such leaders? I think the way we do it is, whatever their cause is, you support it, you show up for it, you let them know, because part of it is encouragement and showing you believe in them, and talk to them about it, but talk to others about it and share that person's vision and what they're thinking.
Yeah, right here.
All right, we spoke about it over here, and we feel that individually, everybody brings their talent to the table. We pool our resources. You bring your teachers in behind that leader, your doctors, your nurses, maintenance, everybody. Just bring them as individuals, and collectively we move out. Yeah.
Good. All right, now we're going. Whoever the mic gets to first.
Who was it? You.
Thanks. We spoke briefly about how, well, at least this is my opinion, is that we actually can't support our leaders how they need to be supported until we build up our own economic base as a black community. In the book, Martin Luther King gave a figure of about $80 billion was the spending power of the black community back in the 60s. Today, it's over $1 trillion. We're over 40 million people in this country. And he spoke about how other groups, they don't have to say Jewish power, Italian power, et cetera. But the black community was shifting towards that instead of, well, Martin Luther King didn't say this, but I'm going to say it, instead of working on building up our own economic base.
Yeah, good point. Thank you.
Hi, Fred Stevenson. Our table talked about the two things, and what was separating was individually and collectively. So I think I'll start with individually. I think individually, each of us have to reflect on what would stop us from contributing individually. Maybe we were groomed with fear. Maybe we were groomed with insecurities. Maybe our talents don't have us out front. And I gave an example. So I told Pastor Bob the scripture about when Isaiah says, "Here I am, Lord, send me." I said, well, I'm not Isaiah, but I'll finance Isaiah.
Okay.
If there's an Isaiah out there, I'll pay for Isaiah to go. But I won't go, right? So there's some Isaiahs out there, and then there's logistical people that would help Isaiah go. So my dad, I grew up in a small town in Alabama, and I asked my dad, because I was born in 1965, I said, how did you support the civil rights movement? He goes, well, we weren't out front because, that just weren't our town, and we knew we would catch repercussions. But what we did was we supported those people out front by feeding them, giving them a place to stay, making signs so they can hold them. So that just kind of made me think about how all of us individually can know what our talents are and contribute, and then collectively know where we are, where it's in operations, logistics, being the person that talks, and have civil discourse, or maybe it's the person that is good in writing, things like that. I think we could do that. But I think we also have to find what the distraction is that keeps us from being motivated to do so and correct that.
Good. In the back. He's gonna get his steps in.
My name is Isaiah, and I'd like to get that credit card as soon as this is over.
He had cash, not a credit card.
I think we could all, some of us are business people, own businesses or whatever, or somebody that has a business. We've talked about this before. If you want to help somebody, to give them a food and clothing, but the economic structure, if you give somebody an opportunity to help themselves by a job or a career, to me, that's the best way that we could all support people getting out of poverty and having situations like that. A lot of development in Oak Park, new buildings going in. Is that right, Daniel? And a lot of things going on. But I think that's the main thing to do, is try to help somebody help themselves.
I might also add, if you didn't, I'm sure you noticed, but you just take the march where this really came to the public purview of Black Power, and then other things followed. Martin Luther King didn't agree with it at all, but you didn't see him publicly blasting the people that were advocating for that. He felt it was his job. I need to figure out how to show them that won't work. Right? But today, in my time during the protests here in town, I would see if we disagreed with each other, we blast the other side. And that, it's pretty hard to support leaders when we're blasting each other. And I'll just use one example before I'm going to read you some lyrics and see which ones of you can remember this song. During the protests, when I was chief, I was really worried about our city burning down. That was my biggest concern, in addition to dealing with the actual incidents, Stephon Clark, George Floyd, those sort of things. And I called on people like Pastor Bob and other pastors and other community leaders. And I know many of them did not agree that the police department was in the right. But I asked them, could we just support each other as a community and ask that don't burn our city down to the protesters? We're not going to comment on the case or any of those other things. We're supporting our city. And many leaders came together and supported our city. And I guarantee you, if there was a group of 10 leaders standing on the stage, they didn't all agree with each other. But they agreed that our city was better off not burning to the ground. That's what they agreed on. They found that common ground, and they came together to support that. And that's how they coalesced. Awesome reflections. So I'm going to read a line at a time. I don't want you to say anything. Just raise your hand if you know what song this is and who sang it. And as I go, maybe more and more hands will rise. Some people say we get a lot of malice. Some say it's a lot of nerve. Okay? But I say we won't quit moving until we get what we deserve. 1. We've been buked and we've been scorned. We've been treated bad, talked about as sure as you are born. 2. Greg, did you raise it? That's 3. But just as sure as it takes two eyes to make a pair, brother, we can't quit until we get our share. Oh, still only three. Now we're people. We're like the birds and the bees. We rather die on our feet than keep living on our knees. All right, that's 4. I'm surprised Jerry doesn't know that song. Okay, all right. All right, so again, these lyrics are from, this song got released in 1968. A great year, I might add. Probably the greatest year of all time. This year I was born. And it reflects the black power kind of sentiment, right? We'd rather die on our feet than keep living on our knees.
Put your bad self, say it loud. Say it loud.
You get up here,
look here. Some people say we got a lot of malice. Some say it's a lot of nerve. But I say we won't quit moving until we get what we deserve. We've been buked and we've been scorned. We've been treated bad, talked about, as sure as you born. Just as sure as it takes 2 eyes to make a pair. Brother, we can't quit until we get our share. Say it loud. Say it loud. One more time. Say it loud. I've worked on jobs with my feet in my hand. You know, all the work I did was for the other man. But now we demand a chance to do things for ourselves. We're tired of beating our head against the wall and working for someone else. Say it loud. Say it loud. Say it loud. Say it loud. Someone else. Look at here, one more thing I got to say right here. Now we're people. We like the birds and the bees. We'd rather die on our feet, keep living on our knees. Say it loud. Say it loud. Say it loud. Lord, Lord, Lord. Say it loud. All right now, Lord, you know we can do now we can say but the funky part of it. Now we do. Sometimes we dance, we sing and we.
So just remember, I can't imagine, I always think, man, I went through a lot as chief, but I still could not imagine being Martin Luther King, right? You're fighting against what you're fighting for, you know, equality, all those things. The government's coming for you. They're spying on you. The people that like segregation are fighting against you. You got death threats every day. You got stabbed signing your book. And then your own community is turning on you. Something you've given your whole life to. He was only in his 30s when he was killed. You've given your whole life to, and people are going, that's nonsense. That's no good anymore. And yet, he kept going. He kept doing what he believed in. I often think, how many of us could imagine us doing that? And how many of us, I can't say I wouldn't, how many of us would go, you know what, I'm just going to go back to preaching in my church. I'll let somebody else fight this fight for a while. But he didn't, and he lost his life for it. So thank you all for coming. I'll stick around if you have any questions for me, but I'd like to invite Pastor Susie up to close us out. We're a few minutes over. Sorry. What?
We all contribute, and you all showing up makes me really proud to be a part of Midtown Church. The fact that we have things like this on a regular basis, and we want to make sure that the church is being the church, especially in this day and age. And so Chief Hahn doing this book club, you all showing up. Anna, I'm going to point you out right now. I hope that's okay. She's going to be doing an immigration workshop for us on the last Monday. So February 24th, if you are a loved one, or if you have questions around all of the changes around this administration and immigration policies. Yes, we're working on actually trying to get a translator present there. And also, just so you know, because we have had questions around this too, it is, it's one person. We're gonna make sure she has some support there, but it's not a legal counsel night. It is gonna be an information workshop. We do have people from other churches who have been asking if they can attend as well. But also, just so you know, we're also not advertising it the same way that we would some of our other workshops and classes, just because of the sensitive nature of the times and the group that it's for. So if you have questions, you can come ask us afterwards. But like I said, I'm just so proud that at Midtown Church, we center conversations like this. We're not shying away from conversations that are necessary. We want to live out God's mandate to be people of justice. So I'm just really grateful that you all showed up. We're gonna have this two more Tuesdays, right, Chief Hahn? 2 more. And then after that, in March, we have another thing called Come to the Table that's going to be happening on Monday nights here as well. So that's also a group like this where we sit at tables and we talk more about racial justice. CRT, DEI, these are all buzzwords right now, but we're going to go into that from a biblical perspective. So if you want a place to talk about that with your brothers and sisters, sign up online and you can ask us more questions about that as well. We want to get you all home, so let me just close in prayer. God, thank you again for being who you are. You are a God who has made us the beautiful multi-ethnic church, and you have called us to be people who walk humbly with you, who act justly and love mercy. So may we be faithful to that call, and may we be part of how you want to show your goodness, your grace, and your glory to this world. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you for joining us.